Well, it's been a pleasure to be here in this conference, and I enjoyed renewing my acquaintance with Jim Bryant, whom I haven't seen in several years, but I appreciate his ministry and his friendship, and also getting to know for the first time Steve, because I've not been familiar with his ministry basically until I heard about this conference. I've heard of the work, but never met you and didn't know very much about what you were doing. You even have your own app. Raymond, did you hear that? They have an app. Where do people go to get our app?
In the future.
Oh, Back to the Future. Okay. Okay. Now we're going to be flying through this. Session. I have a lot of slides, so we may skip around because at the end of this session, I want to show a brief video, and it's a clip from Schindler's List. And before we start, I'm giving you this disclaimer. Schindler's List is not a family film. I don't want anybody to come back to me later and say, well, you showed a clip, so we went to Netflix and got Schindler's List, and our kids were sitting there. And Schindler's List is a very brutal, bloody, very raw movie because Steven Spielberg wanted to show the Holocaust in all of its horror. And so it is not a family movie. Now repeat after me, it's not a family movie. They understand. Okay, so I'm off the hook. But we have about a 4-minute clip we're going to show at the end of this because to me it has something to say to us as believers. But in the meantime, let's get to part 2 of Israel, God's Timepiece. And what we're talking about, of course, is God's plan for the end times. And the next slide is a clock is a device that we use to tell the time. We all know that. And is that slide number 2 on your numbers there on the it's number 2? Okay, just want to make sure because I may skip some, and I'll just give you a number. Yeah. Okay, the next slide, number 3, a prophetic clock helps us tell the time prophetically. Basically, it's a metaphor. Israel is a clock. That's a metaphor. It means that there's a correlation between Israel, God's plan for Israel, and God's plan for the rest of the world. So if we want to know, as believers, what time it is on God's prophetic calendar, we can look at Israel. Now, did you all get the handouts? They're getting those out. By the way, we did have some left over from last night. If you're here today and you weren't here last night, that's part 2. So part 1 is over here. If you didn't get the study sheet from yesterday, there's some extras right there for you. So let's talk about slide 4, 3 things the clock cannot do. This is like a disclaimer. The last time I presented this material was about a month ago in Ukraine, in the Kiev area. And so I have to be very clear when we're talking cross-culturally just to make sure there are no misunderstandings. So here are 3 disclaimers on what the clock cannot do. Number 1, it's not a magical crystal ball. Bible prophecy is not about satisfying some carnal, shallow, sensational curiosity about the future. It's about God's future plan for this world and how we can participate in that plan. Number 2, it's not a date-setting device. The purpose of the clock is not to enable us to know a specific date for the rapture. And over the centuries, we all know there have been many people who have set dates for the rapture of the church, and those dates always, up to now, have come and gone, and the rapture hasn't happened. It's a bad testimony. It reflects badly on us as believers, and the most important thing about it is it desensitizes the world to the truth of Christ's return. They get desensitized. Oh, those crazy Christians are at it again, setting dates. Jesus is coming back. Ooh, Jesus is coming back again. Listen, it's bad. That is bad. It desensitizes people to the truth of the coming of the Lord. And number 3, it's not an escape mechanism. The second coming is not a way for us to escape our responsibilities. Now, I know this is being streamed live, and I hope I don't embarrass anybody, but I was preaching somewhere about 2 years ago in a southern state, Georgia, the Atlanta area. And a man approached me and said, Brother Hedrick, he said, I got to ask you a serious question. I said, well, what is it? And he said, when is the rapture going to happen? I need to know. And I said, well, I don't know. Nobody knows. It could happen before we're done talking here. I said, why do you ask? He said, I'm in a lot of trouble. I said, what do you mean you're in a lot of trouble? He hadn't paid income taxes in 12 years. He hadn't paid income taxes in 12 years, but that wasn't his biggest problem. His bigger problem was his wife. He said his wife was about to have a nervous breakdown because she was afraid. She would lay in bed at night, afraid somebody's going to knock the door down and come in and black-coated agents drag him off to prison. She was about to have a nervous breakdown. He said, I need to know if the rapture is going to happen soon because I need it to happen soon. But listen, the rapture is not an escape mechanism. It's not a way for us to escape our responsibilities. So I'm going to go on record here today as telling you, pay your taxes. You say, well, Brother Gary, the government shut down. That doesn't matter. You know what? They didn't shut down that part of it. I've got bad news. I hope I'm not bursting your bubble, but you still got to pay your taxes. Okay, so 4 things it does do. First of all, it helps us contextualize current events. The Lord Jesus will come back to this earth. He promised he would. He said before he left, he promised that he would come back. When that time comes, will that generation of believers be caught off guard? Will it come as a surprise? I hope not, because the Bible does give us an abundance, I believe, of information that helps us contextualize and analyze and recognize current events as they may relate prophetically. The prophetic clock helps us, number 2. Another thing it does, it teaches us how to be God's distinctive people. And the emphasis there is on holiness. Now that's something you don't hear taught very much. I know you do in this church because I know Jim Bryant and your other teachers here. But in many churches, there's very little emphasis on holiness. And yet that is one of the main features of the way the Bible presents prophecy. The purpose of prophecy, one of the purposes of prophecy, is to motivate us to live holy and godly lives. Now don't take the time to turn to it, but I'm going to read 2 Peter 3, verses 11 through 13. Listen to what Peter says. Therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, and you mentioned this, Jim, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness? Verse 12, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. There's the teaching of prophecy. He talks about the coming of the day of God, the heavens being dissolved, being on fire. But then he says, in which righteousness dwells. And he says, what manner of persons ought we to be in holy conduct and righteousness, godliness. So one of the purposes of prophecy is to motivate us to live holy and godly lives. So it teaches us how to be God's distinctive people. Number 3, it helps us maintain an Israel-centric prophetic grid. It helps us maintain an Israel-centric prophetic grid. The purpose of the clock is to help us process the prophetic information in a biblical way and to understand it the way God intends for it to be understood. And one way we do that is by keeping Israel in the center. A grid, you know what a grid is, right? You look at a grid, a map. A grid is, they divide it into different squares, and the grid helps you identify different parts, and it helps you see, well, this part fits here, and this part fits here, and this goes down here, and everything fits together, and you see the overall picture. And by putting Israel in the center, where God intends for Israel to be prophetically, it helps us process all of the information and helps us to see the whole picture. So it helps us maintain an Israel-centric prophetic grid. And you can see on this map that's next, here is the world. And if you look, we had, apparently this is a different picture from the one we had last night. I don't know how that happened. But if you look here, in the center of this picture is Israel. And everything emanates from there, the whole world. Israel is the navel of the earth, the Bible says. The Hebrew word is navel, literally the umbilical cord of the earth. The center of the earth is Israel. And that's true not only geographically, but also theologically, as we talked about yesterday. And then number 4, it assures us that God keeps his promises both to Israel and the church. Here's what happens. Sometimes when we're teaching like this in churches, people will say, Christian people will say, why should I be concerned about the promises God made to Israel? I'm not Jewish. That has nothing to do with me. I'm a Christian. Why should I be concerned? Well, the reason we should all be concerned is that if God made promises to his earthly people Israel, and he did not and is not going to keep those promises, that's right, somebody's already got it over here. How can we know that he will keep his promises to us? That's the question. That's a tough one. If you take the position that God rejected his people because they were bad, they rejected him, they didn't recognize or receive the Messiah, if you take the position that God pushed them aside, they are gone, they are washed up, they are finished as far as God is concerned because of what they did, and now he's not going to keep the promises he made. And we saw earlier today, God said, the land promise, he said that was for how long? Forever. Forever. But if if he's going to renege on that, he's not going to keep his promise, then how can we know he's going to keep his promises to us? I'm here to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, God always keeps his promises. Amen. God always keeps his promises. And that includes the promises he made to the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Promises about a future messianic age, promises about them being restored to their land, promises about them being restored and planted in their land, never to be uprooted again, and to be dwelling there in security, surrounded not by foes and enemies and people who threaten them, but surrounded with security and comfort and prosperity and holiness and the righteousness of God and the glory of God dwelling, the Shekinah, the presence of God dwelling in their land again. So the clock metaphor, the clock metaphor simply says that when Israel is not in her land, God's prophetic plan goes into stasis, the clock stops ticking. We talked about that yesterday. When Israel is not in her land, nothing, go to the next slide, nothing prophetically significant happens. We already covered that. It also means, slide 15, it also means that when Israel returns to her land, the prophetic clock starts ticking again. You've already got that. So watching the clock, now here's what this is all about. 5 end-time convergences. And you can see there's 5 of them. The labor convergence, the anti-Israel convergence, the Daniel convergence. Somebody was asking about Daniel yesterday. I told you we'd talk about it, but we're going to have to really fly through Daniel. Yeah. So, And then 4 is the Jerusalem convergence, and 5 is the Messianic convergence. They all have to do with the people of Israel. Not the church, but Israel. National Israel is the key. You know, sometimes people tell me, I just don't understand prophecy. I've tried, but I read one book and one person says one thing, I read another book, they say something else. I don't know if it's amillennial, premillennial, or post-millennial. I don't know what I believe. I don't know what to believe. I just don't understand prophecy. One reason they don't understand prophecy is that they are missing the key. The key is national Israel. Let me tell you something. If you try to take Israel, let's just say you're an amillennialist, you believe God is finished with Israel, Israel is passé, Israel is gone. If you take that position and you take Israel out of the equation, you are never going to understand prophecy. I told you last night that I read Harold Camping's book. I checked it today. I think last night I said it was 300 or 400 pages. It was actually more like 500 pages. He was amillennial. He took Israel out of the equation. That book is so confusing. I told you, I read the entire book. When I was done, I didn't know any more about his view than I did before I started because it was so confusing. Why is it confusing? Because he takes Israel out of the equation. He doesn't understand that God is not finished with Israel. Israel has a future. And I guess these people think that what happened in 1948 was just some kind of an accident. I mean, come on. Ladies and gentlemen, how gullible do you have to be? How naive do you have to be to believe that something like that could happen? That a people could be driven out of their land 2,000 years ago and their country destroyed, their capital city burned to the ground, the temple burned to the ground. I mean, to the extent that it was just completely leveled, and the Temple Mount was so thoroughly destroyed that they sowed salt so that not even weeds could grow there. And that was 2,000 years ago. And then 2,000 years later, those same people come back to that same land, and that same nation is reborn for the first time in 2,000 years. When has that ever happened in the history of the world? How naive would someone have to be to say, you know what, 1948, that doesn't mean anything. That was just a coincidence. That was just some weird accident of history. Listen, it was no weird accident. It was the hand of Almighty God. God is at work. So we have these convergences, and they say that, they help us put the pieces of the puzzle together so that by having Israel in the center, we can understand. It begins to take shape, and we can understand what God is doing. So let's talk about these convergences, and we're going to skip to 19. Number 19, the labor convergence. The labor convergence is the one on slide 20. Labor has to do with childbirth. The definition of labor is the painful and often prolonged process a woman endures immediately before she gives birth. How many of you ladies can say amen to that? Listen, my wife gave birth to 3 babies. I was there for all 3 of them. Yes, I take credit for part of that. But listen, that was quite an ordeal. Now, my wife's first doctor was from the old school. His name was Dr. Gibson. He was a professor at the School of Medicine in Peoria, Illinois, where we lived at the time. And Dr. Gibson was from the old school. You know what the old school gynecologists believed? If you didn't have pain in childbirth, you hadn't paid your dues. And she went through, it was horrible. And I remember I was holding her hands, and she would grab when she was having a contraction, and she would just grab me like that, and she was throwing me, and I'm not a small guy, and she was just throwing me around like a rag doll, and then she finally pulled me right, where my face is. She said, "Get me something for the pain." I said, "I'll ask them." She said, "You don't ask, you tell them." I'm not asking, I'm telling. And, but Dr. Gibson, finally he did order something for the pain. But after Elizabeth was born, my wife decided to make a change in doctors. And so we went on a kind of a little circuit interviewing doctors. She found a Catholic doctor, Dr. O'Neill, and he was also a professor at the School of Medicine, and a really neat guy. And we sat down in his office, and she said, "Talk to me about your philosophy on pain." And he said, "Well, Mrs. Hedrick, let me put it like this. If any of my patients has even a twinge of discomfort, I consider myself to be a total and utter failure." She said, "You're hired." And he delivered our next two. But labor is the process where children are born. There are two kinds of labor. Slide 22, there's false labor, which feels like the real thing, but it stops without the baby being born. And let me tell you something. If mama has to go home from the hospital without a baby, mama ain't happy. We did that once with Elizabeth. The false labor, we thought it was the real thing, but it wasn't. True labor, slide 23, true labor increases in frequency and intensity, and it doesn't stop until the baby is born. What's the difference? Slide 24, there's the difference between true labor and false labor. The true labor results in a baby. And in studying prophecy, slide 25, we must distinguish between true and false labor. True labor, slide 26, I told you we were going to move fast. Slide 26, true labor means the baby is born. False labor means no birth occurs yet. Now, we apply that principle prophetically. True labor means the Messiah returns. False labor means the Messiah doesn't return yet. Messianic birth pangs. All these, Matthew 24:8, all these are the beginning of sorrows. The word sorrows there in Greek is the word odin, and it literally means birth pains. The Greek word odin, birth pains. So he says all these are the beginning of birth pains. Something is going to be born. The Messiah is coming back. Events only become true labor when they happen in concert with all the other signs, and they begin to increase in frequency and intensity, and they don't let up until the baby is born, until the Messiah comes back. None of these things that we're going to talk about in Matthew 24 is by itself a prophetic marker. It's not prophetically significant unless all the other markers are also present. You're doing a good job of keeping up with me. Matthew 24:33, so you also, when you see what? All these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. We were talking earlier about rapture alerts. And the idea is, and I know these people, I don't mean to make fun of them, but what they're saying is, there's an earthquake happened in Chile, so that means the rapture is about to happen. Or, all these other things, any number of things happen, wars, rumors of wars, natural phenomena, things, meteors and meteor showers. And these things are signs of the coming rapture. The fallacy of the reasoning is none of these signs alone is a sign of the rapture. They only become prophetically significant when they happen in concert with all of the other signs. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Okay, all of what things? Matthew 24. Well, what is he talking about? The rise of false messiahs, wars and rumors about wars, nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom, famines, earthquakes, tribulation and martyrdom for believers, infighting in the believing community, the rise of many false prophets, the increase of lawlessness and anarchy, false religionists who perform deceptive miracles in verse 24. So when the Lord says all of these things, These are the things he's talking about, but none of them alone becomes a prophetic marker until it happens in concert with all of the others. Acts 1:8 provides the geographical context for the outworking of God's future plan. And I know we've talked about this before, but we need to hammer away at this, hammer away at it over and over and over until the church gets it. The context is Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then the uttermost parts of the world. It starts in Israel. Israel is at the center. So the labor convergence comes into play when the prophetic signs and trends of Matthew 24, along with all the other signs, begin taking place simultaneously and with increasing frequency and intensity. Okay, that's the first one, the labor convergence. The second one is the anti-Israel convergence. The anti-Israel convergence is Israel against the world. The ancient prophets envisioned a future time when virtually the entire world would be set against Israel. The Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 uses the destruction of Israel by Rome in AD 70 as a template to illustrate a yet future destruction of Israel by another similar future anti-Israel campaign. Well, are we living in days that would be described in that way? You look at the United Nations. What about the United Nations and Israel? Assuming that the United Nations is a fairly representative body, reflecting the views of the nations of the world, the official views of the nations of the world, what has been the relationship between Israel and the United Nations? Well, according to Wikipedia and the UN's own records, and we did this study several years ago, so we probably should update this, but as of 2009, there had been 249 Security Council resolutions passed by the United Nations since 1948, addressing various Israeli-Arab issues and controversies. And out of those 249 UN resolutions, how many do you think were in favor of Israel? Okay? Out of 249, here are your choices. How many of them were in favor of Israel? 248 in favor, 99 in favor, 24 in favor, or 1 in favor? How many think 248? 99? 24? Any takers for 24? Okay, 1 or 2? Okay. Okay, how about 1? Okay, 1 wins, and 1 is right. The only time from 1948 until 2009, the only time the United Nations voted in favor of Israel, slide 46. Oh, you're already there. In 1951, the UN chastised Egypt for prohibiting ships bound for Israeli ports from passing through the Suez Canal. That's the only time the UN has ever sided with Israel, ever. And that was 60 years ago. In 248 other instances, the UN sided with Israel's enemies. Now go to this photograph. Look at that. Now, I don't know if you can see it down there, but this is from the New York Times. We're talking about the anti-Israel convergence, anti-Israel bias in the world. The New York Times, the caption of that photograph says, "An Israeli policeman and a Palestinian on the Temple Mount." It looks like this big, bad, mean Israeli policeman is beating this poor Palestinian boy bloody. Isn't that what it looks like? This big, bad Israeli policeman is beating this kid. Well, that was how it was portrayed in the New York Times. And it came out in the New York Times. The problem was, this boy's dad is a doctor in New York City. He's Jewish. This is a Jewish boy. They are on the Temple Mount. This Jewish boy had been attacked by a Palestinian mob. The Israeli policeman is saving his life. And the last name is Grossman. Dr. Grossman wrote to the New York Times, said, "Why did you put that picture in the paper? That policeman was saving my son's life. He's not a Palestinian." And so the New York Times buried a retraction somewhere in section E, page 105, column, somewhere down there. This is the kind of thing we deal with. Anti-Israel bias. The anti-Israel convergence comes into play along with the other convergences when the international community overwhelmingly supports the declared enemies of the state of Israel. Okay, the Daniel convergence. How are we doing on time? How much more time do I have? 25? Okay, we're good. Okay. The Daniel convergence. Daniel 9. Now, Daniel 9 is a fascinating passage of Scripture. It's interesting that the rabbis have never classified Daniel as a prophet. Did you know that? We know Daniel was a prophet because the Messiah said he was a prophet, the prophet Daniel. But the rabbis have never classified, the Jewish Bible is divided into, the Tanakh is divided into the Torah. The Torah is the 5 books of Moses. And then you have the Nevi'im or the prophets. And then you have the writings, the Ketuvim, the writings. So the Torah, you have the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. They put Daniel in the writings in the Jewish Bible. He is not in the Nevi'im. He's not considered a prophet. I wonder why. Why would Daniel not be considered a prophet by the traditional rabbis? Now, there are Messianic rabbis who do recognize this. Maybe the reason is that Daniel is the only place in the Old Testament where God used a prophet, to actually tell us when the Messiah would appear here on earth. Because in Daniel 9, verse 25, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment. In fact, why don't you turn to that? Daniel 9:25. Daniel 9:25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. Verse 26. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And then verse 27, look at this. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. That is the prince that shall come. He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of that week, and that's a week of 7 years, in the midst of that week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. So here we have these sevens, different sets of sevens. In when we plug in the Jewish understanding, we always tell people you have to understand the Bible from a messianic perspective. You have to look at the Bible through Jewish eyes because it was written in a Jewish culture by Jewish writers. God used Jewish writers to convey his truth in a Jewish culture to a predominantly Jewish audience. So if you try to impose a Gentile, westernized sort of grid on that, you're going to end up with all kinds of mistakes. And when you understand this from a Jewish point of view, Shavah is the Hebrew word for 7. Shavah Shevaim is 7 sevens or 49. When you plug this understanding into this passage, you see that what he's talking about when he says these sevens, he's talking about sevens of years, weeks of years. So it's not, when he talks about a 1 week, It's 7 years. And when we see it that way, Daniel 9 becomes a fascinating prophecy. And the prophecy of Daniel 9:25 to 27 tells us several things. First of all, the Messiah would appear and therefore be born in the 1st century AD. That's the first thing. Number 2, he would be executed, that is, cut off, and appear to have lost everything. It says he will have nothing. That's number 2. Number 3, after an indeterminate interval of time, a counterfeit Messiah, another prince, it's the same word, prince. Another prince will do 2 things. What are those 2 things? First, he will bring peace to the Middle East for 3.5 years. It says the midst of the week. So it's a 7-year week. It's a week of years. So in the midst of the 7 years, and I'm assuming, and there's nothing that says this has to be precise, but when it says in the middle of the 7 years, to me that's 3.5 years. Okay? So at the middle of he will bring peace to the Middle East for 3.5 years. And second, he ultimately desecrates the restored temple in Jerusalem. So the Antichrist will do in the future the same thing that Antiochus did during the revolt in the 3rd century, the same thing that Titus did in 70 AD. He will desecrate the temple, he will destroy the land. So the same thing will happen again. God has provided 2 patterns in the past to point us to this prophetic event in the future. The 2 princes in Daniel 9 are separated by 2,000 years. Verse 25 talks about Messiah, the prince, and verse 26 talks about the prince that shall come, the Antichrist. And in 70 AD he came, that was the Romans. Daniel's 70 weeks, now that's a chart, we don't have time to go into all that. That's a chart that we did for a presentation in Russia. That's the English version, we also have it in Russian. Slide 62, Daniel 9 tells us that God's plan after the Babylonian exile is compressed into 490 non-consecutive years. That is 483 years followed by an interlude and then a final 7 years. What this means is, I know this is a lot of theological jargon. What this means is the 490 years don't happen consecutively. That's one of the mistakes people have made in the past trying to interpret this. They want to point here, and then they count 490 years to here. But they're not consecutive. Think of it, how many of you are Spurs fans? Don't be ashamed. Okay. Anybody else want to fess up while we're being honest here? Okay. All right. We love I'm not there you go, back in the back. I see that hand, yes. My wife is a big Spurs fan. She's a much bigger Spurs fan than I am, and she loves her Spurs. I had to take her to the season opener the other night. But have you ever noticed, and I guess football's the same way, who won the game? Did we win? The Horns won? Good, all right, good. I hope I didn't mess it up for any of you who are TiVoing the game to watch it when you get home. But have you ever noticed, have you ever noticed that in football and in basketball, how long it can take to play the last 5 minutes of the game? You know why? Because the clock isn't running consecutively. It doesn't just keep on running. It stops and starts. It stops and starts. The ball is in play, the ball is out of play. And so it can take 25, 30 minutes to play 3 or 4 minutes of basketball. That's just the way it is. Well, that's kind of the way it is here because the 490 years are not consecutive. And sometimes people don't understand that, but here's one way of looking at it. The only way the Messiah's death could be after the 69th week, which is what it says in verse 26, without it occurring in the 70th week, is if there's some sort of a gap between the 69th and 70th week. You see how simple that is? The Bible says it's after the 69th week, but then the 70th week doesn't start right then. It's later. So there has to be some sort of time interval between the 69th and 70th weeks. And of course, we believe, as good dispensationalists, that that's the church age. We're in that gap right now. The prince shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, it says in the Greek text. The prince that will come is the prince who will be a successor to the people who destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. So I believe he will be Roman or otherwise European. He may be German. The Daniel convergence comes into play along with all the other convergences when the scene is set for a binding, strong Mideast peace agreement involving all parties, many or a multitude. The Hebrew word is rav, a multitude. So here's something to watch for. You know, we were talking about rapture alerts. Here's a rapture alert for you. When you see an Antichrist brokered peace agreement that lasts 7 years, then you can start packing your bags. Now, sometimes people say, you know, the Antichrist, won't that be kind of a signal when, I mean, we'll be watching CNN and there'll be like a microphone, people, and they're in the sky and the badge says Antichrist. No. We're not even going to hear, well, we won't be here, but they're not even going to hear the word Antichrist. That's a biblical term, anti-Messiah. He'll have another name. He'll be a president or a premier, a prime minister of, Germany or some European nation. He won't be known as the Antichrist, but he will broker a peace agreement, and the term of that peace agreement will be 7 years. If something like that happens, folks, I'm telling you, that is a rapture alert right there, and that's the real deal, as long as it happens in concert with all the other signs at the same time. Number 4, the Jerusalem convergence, and we're going to skip Zechariah 12:3 says, "It shall happen in that day that I will make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all peoples. All who would heave it away will surely be cut in pieces, though all nations of the earth are gathered against it." Zechariah 12:3. Much of the modern day Mideast controversy centers around the city of Jerusalem. You all know this, and we talked about who owns the land, and we've already, slide 70, we've already talked about ownership and possession, so you already know that information. And the Jerusalem convergence comes into play when all the nations of the earth involve themselves in the administration of the ancient city. Is that what we're seeing today? I think so. These are some scenes from Israel. Go to the next one. This is something we see when we're in Israel. The United Nations they have their vehicles all over the place. They're in the north, they're in the south, they're in Jerusalem, Judea, they're everywhere. And they are very much involved in the administration of Israel. And lastly, number 5, the Messianic convergence. Ezekiel 37 is the prophecy of the dry bones. You all know this prophecy. Ezekiel 37 verses 7 to 10, the prophecy about the dry bones is fulfilled in stages, not all at one time. Here are the stages in Ezekiel 37. First, in verse 7, there was a noise. Secondly, also in verse 7, there was a shaking. And then thirdly, in verse 7 again, bones came together. In verse 8, muscles, tendons, and skin were added. In verse 10, infused with the breath of life. Those are the stages of the resurrection in Ezekiel 37. Where do you think we are in this process right now? I personally think we're in between noise and the shaking. The bones are just beginning to come together. Israel is back in her land. The body is there, but there's still no breath of life. But you know what? There is a remnant according to the election of grace. There are more Jewish believers in the world today than there have been at any time in the last 2,000 years. The rattling of the bones, here's some of the names. We're not going to go through all that. In the 1800s, maybe some of you know Felix Mendelssohn, Benjamin Disraeli. These are all Jewish believers in Jesus. And when does this Messianic convergence come into play? It comes into play went along with all the other convergences. Noticeably significant numbers of Jewish people are coming to faith in their Messiah. And you know what? For 2,000 years, the devil has been doing his best to keep the Jewish people separated from two things. First, their land, and secondly, their Messiah. And you can see how diabolically brilliant he has been, because he has been largely successful in keeping the Jewish people separated from their land and their Messiah. But in the last 200 years, the barriers have been starting to crumble. 1948, Israel was restored to her land in the Middle East. Amazing, miraculous circumstances. And more Jewish people are coming to faith in the Messiah. We were just in Israel not long ago, just a few months ago, and we met some people who were believers, and we were out on the street, and one of the ladies, and one of the young ladies in the IDF, she was a soldier. The women serve in the armed forces in Israel, and she saw our group, and she said, "Who are you guys?" And we told her we were Messianic, a Jewish Christian group. And she said, "Are you Jewish?" I said, "No, I'm not Jewish, but we love Israel. We love the Jewish people." And she said, "Are you like Jews for Jesus?" She said, "Are you like Jews for Jesus?" And I said, "Yeah, very much like that." And she said, "All right, yeah." This is just a girl on the street. This is a soldier in the IDF, a young woman, probably 19 or 20 years old. You see, there's an undercurrent bubbling under the surface. God is at work. Amazing things are happening. And here's the founder of our ministry, Dr. Charles Howe. We were having dinner at a Mexican place here in San Antonio. I thought I had that somewhere. Look at 84. Look at number 84. 84. 84. I want you to see Charles. He's there somewhere. Charles, where are you? 84. No? Okay. Well, anyway. Yeah, did you see him? Okay. I don't get to talk about this. I don't get to talk about this in San Antonio very much. So all of you live here, so you know the Howe family, and you know what Temple Bethel is. Usually I'm out somewhere else talking, and people are saying, "Oh yeah, I don't know what any of that means." But you folks live here, so you know. And we had Mexican food one afternoon, and he'd put on his best suit. He was fixed up, and the restaurant was La Fogata, not far from Temple Bethel. So I said, "While we're out, let's go take a picture of you standing in front of Temple Bethel." And he said, "Oh, I'd like that," because he was all dressed up. And so we took this picture, and he died not too many months after this. And he was the black sheep of the Howe family, and because of his faith in Jesus, and had quite a testimony, and we all loved him. But there are an estimated 6,000 to 8,000 Messianic believers in Israel today, and the numbers are increasing. When all five convergences come together, what do we have? We have a bullseye. When all five of these convergences happen at the same time, increase in frequency and intensity, and all of it comes together, then we have a bullseye. So I want to finish this presentation today with a clip, because this is about Oskar Schindler. If any of you have ever been to Israel, and I know a number of you have, did any of you visit his grave? Okay, just one or two of you have been to his grave. Oskar Schindler was a Catholic man in Germany during World War II. He was an industrialist, and he was a businessman, and he wined and dined the Nazi leadership, got himself into the power structure of the Nazi Party. He joined the Nazi Party. He had a gold pin identifying himself as a member of the Nazi Party. And while he was inside the leadership of the Nazi Party, he built a business by basically bribing Nazis to let him build their stuff. He built pots and pans for the military. He also built shells for munitions. He once said, he told a friend, that if he ever, if one shell casing ever left one of his factories that would work, he would consider himself a failure. But he did it, and he didn't get caught until near the very end. He had to pay huge sums of money, and he had a bookkeeper, a Jewish bookkeeper, that he loved. This man was like his brother. And they worked together to save the lives of hundreds of Jewish people. And what Oskar Schindler did was he bought Jewish people. He spent a fortune purchasing Jewish people from the Nazis. And he put them in his factories to build shell casings that didn't work, and gave them work, gave them jobs, and that way they couldn't be sent to the concentration camps. At the end of the war, you're going to see a scene here, at the very end of the war, the Nazis have surrendered, the Russians are coming in, and Oskar Schindler is at his factory. It's at night. He's at his factory, and he's talking to the Jewish people. There were 1,100 Jewish people working in that factory that he had saved. 1,100. And they said at the end that he could have done more. He said, I could have done more. I could have done more. I could have sold my car. I could have sold this gold button. This right here would be one Jewish person, maybe two Jewish people. I could have saved more. And when I see this scene in Schindler's List, it makes me think, why shouldn't we be at least that committed to sharing the gospel with Jewish people, as committed as Oskar Schindler was to purchasing their freedom and saving their physical lives? Here's the how many of you have seen the movie? At the very end of, oh, most of you have. At the very end of the movie, it shows the descendants of the Schindler Jews, 6,000. 6,000 descendants, 6,000 people who are descended from the Jewish people whose lives he saved. But we have the good news of Yeshua the Messiah. Why shouldn't we be at least that committed, and even more committed, to sharing with them the good news of Jesus Christ, their Messiah? That's what, for me, this is all about, sharing the good news of Yeshua with the Jewish people. God bless you.